In the shadowed corners of medieval Europe, love and desire often took dark and twisted forms, far removed from the idealized romances of chivalry and courtly love. One such tale from the 13th century is that of Id and Olive, a story that blurs the lines between love, identity, and the unacceptable. Id, a young woman from Spain, found herself in a desperate situation. To escape the oppressive control of her father, she made the bold decision to disguise herself as a man and flee. Her journey led her to Rome, where fate had a cruel twist in store. The king's daughter, Olive, laid eyes on Id and was immediately entranced. The beauty and grace of the young man captivated her, and before long Olive and Id were married. On their wedding night, Id, still disguised as a man, faced a dilemma. She could not bring herself to consummate the marriage, so she pretended to be ill. They spent the night in a passionate embrace, kissing and hugging. Some might see this as a chaste and innocent moment, but the language used in the tale suggests something more intimate, hinting at a hidden, homoerotic encounter between the two women. 2 weeks into their marriage, Olive discovered Id's secret. The shock was immense, but the situation was even more complicated. The king, upon learning of the deception, demanded a public examination. In a bizarre and cruel twist, God intervened, transforming Id into a man at the last moment. This miraculous change allowed the marriage to continue, but it left a lasting mark on the story, a testament to the complex and often dangerous nature of love and identity in a world where norms were rigidly enforced. Similar tales can be found in the rich tapestry of medieval literature, such as the story from the 1001 Nights. In this tale, Princess Budur, disguised as a man, marries Hayat al-Nufus. The two women share intimate moments, and on the third night, Budur reveals her true identity. Hayat al-Nufus, instead of rejecting her, fakes her defloration with chicken blood and accepts Budur's secret. The story continues with Budur's eventual reunion with her husband, Kamar al-Zaman, and the complex web of relationships that ensues. These stories, though filled with moments of tenderness and love, also reveal the harsh realities of medieval life. Women, often at the mercy of their fathers, husbands, and the men who controlled their lives, had limited options. The cross-dressing and same-sex encounters in these tales were not always voluntary, but rather a means of survival or a momentary escape from a rigid and oppressive society. In the Umayyad court of 9th century Baghdad, the lines between gender and sexuality were further blurred. Enslaved women were dressed as boys, known as gulami, to cater to the sexual desires of the court. These women, though not necessarily engaging in same-sex relations, were used to satisfy the men's appetites, highlighting the complex and often exploitative nature of power and desire. Medieval medical texts, too, offer a glimpse into the world of women's sexuality. These texts suggest that midwives could use manual manipulation to relieve the congested condition of a woman's genitalia, a practice that, while not considered a sexual act, acknowledges the possibility of women pleasuring other women. The wives of Italian merchants, for example, used dildos to satisfy their desires while their husbands were away, a practice that, while frowned upon, was not entirely unheard of. Literary texts, such as the Catalan romance Turent lo Blanc, provide further insight. In this tale, the hero watches as a maid fondles the princess, playing the role of a man. The princess, rather than objecting, seems to find the experience acceptable, if not enjoyable. This scene, written for the titillation of male readers, reveals the complex dynamics of power and desire between women, often mediated by the male gaze. The issue of rape, a violent and coercive act, was a grim reality in medieval society. The lack of a clear distinction between rape and consensual sex, combined with the limited rights of women, meant that many women were forced into sexual encounters against their will. The medical belief that a woman could not become pregnant without experiencing pleasure added to the victim-blaming culture. Even in cases where a woman's consent was not given, the act was often seen as a matter of the man's right, rather than a violation of the woman's autonomy. In the 13th century Icelandic Grettir's saga, the hero Grettir rapes a servant girl, a scene that, while shocking, reflects the broader societal norms of the time. The girl's initial resistance gives way to a grudging acceptance, highlighting the limited power and agency of women in such situations. Marriage, too, often involved a form of coercion. Young women, particularly in the aristocracy, were frequently married off as part of political alliances, with little say in the matter. The line between marriage and rape could be thin, especially in cases where women were forced into unions as a form of reconciliation after conflicts. In the Byzantine novel Rodin and Docicles, the title characters navigate a world where the distinction between abduction and elopement is blurred. The hero, Docicles, considers raping Rodin, but ultimately chooses not to, a decision that reflects the complex moral landscape of the time. In Islamic jurisprudence, the issue of consent was more elaborated, but this did not always translate into better outcomes for women. The Maliki school, which treated sex as a commodity, offered more opportunities for women to seek redress, while the Hanafi school, with its theocentric approach, made it difficult to prove rape. Rape in the Middle Ages was also understood as a crime of violence, with a focus on the physical harm inflicted rather than the lack of consent. This shift in legal and social perspectives reflected the changing dynamics of power and the ways in which those in authority thought about sex and gender. Incest, another taboo, adds another layer of complexity to the medieval landscape. The high mortality rates often led to step-families, but there is little evidence of stepfather-daughter abuse. When incest was mentioned, it was often in the context of biological relations, reflecting the deep-seated fears and taboos of the time. These stories, though often shocking, offer a window into the lives of medieval women, their struggles, and their moments of resistance. They remind us that the past, with its rigid norms and often oppressive structures, was a place where love and desire could take many forms, some beautiful, some dark, but always complex. In medieval stories, tales of incest between fathers and daughters were not often based on mistaken identity. Unlike the stories of mother-son incest, where the characters might not know they were related, these stories involved a father who knew exactly what he was doing. The father's actions were often attributed to cruelty, madness, or the influence of the devil. One famous example is from the story of Apollonius of Tyre, where King Antiochus rapes his daughter. The story describes how he struggled with his desires, but ultimately gave in to his lust, forcefully taking her virginity despite her resistance. Another common theme in these stories involved a man who, after the death of his wife, became so distraught that he decided to marry his daughter, who resembled her mother. This was not seen as a story about incest, but rather as a lesson in patience and perseverance. The daughter faces many hardships, but she remains virtuous and is ultimately rewarded by heaven. The story highlights the challenges a daughter might face in a patriarchal society, where the father had significant control over her life, including her marriage. While such coercion was not presented as a common issue, it reflects a possible medieval anxiety about a daughter's ability to resist her father's demands. Another well-known story, Gregorius, illustrates a different form of incest and its consequences. In this tale, a brother and sister who share a room are tempted by the devil to have sex. The sister, to avoid dishonor, does not cry out, and the brother assaults her. Their son, abandoned and raised separately, later marries his mother without knowing their relationship. When they discover the truth, they repent, and the son eventually becomes the pope. The story emphasizes the importance of repentance, suggesting that even double incest can be forgiven if followed by sincere contrition. The medieval church's incest taboo extended beyond immediate family members to include more distant relatives. Robert Manning, a 14th-century English moralist, warned men against having sex with sex workers, as they might unknowingly have sex with a relative. This reasoning was based on the idea that a man could not be sure of the woman's past relationships, which could include his own relatives. However, the most common form of sexual coercion in the Middle Ages was not incest but slavery. Enslaved women were often subjected to sexual abuse by their owners, who had the legal right to do as they wished with their property. In Christian Europe, this meant that the women and their children had few rights. For example, a letter from Genoa in the 13th century describes an enslaved woman who claimed her former owner had impregnated her. The owner, however, denied this and suggested the woman could be thrown into the sea with her unborn child. This attitude reflects the view that the woman's rights and the child's well-being were not considered important. In Muslim regions, the situation was different. A child born to an enslaved woman by her owner had the same rights as a child born in marriage, and the mother was often freed upon the owner's death. In Christian Europe, however, such rights were rarely recognized. Some enslaved women were forced to abandon their children at foundling hospitals, while others raised their children within the household, either as enslaved or free. In regions like Italy and southern France, the majority of enslaved people were women, who were often purchased for domestic labor and sexual use. The demand for enslaved women was driven by both their perceived ethnic attractiveness and the need for household services. And married men might buy enslaved women to perform the roles typically filled by a wife, while married men could also exploit the women in their households. The law treated sexual acts with enslaved women as property offenses against the owner, rather than crimes against the women themselves. Even in the North, enslaved women faced similar forms of coercion. In the Icelandic Laxdæla saga, a man named Höskuldur purchases an enslaved woman, Melkorka, as a concubine. Despite the cultural differences, the power dynamics between the owner and the enslaved woman remained the same. The woman's ability to resist was limited by her lack of economic and social power. Women's sexuality was also seen as a threat to medieval men in other ways. They were often portrayed as temptresses who could lead men into sin, or as sorceresses who could use magic to control them. The Malleus Maleficarum, a 15th century text written by two German Dominican friars, is a notorious example of this belief. The authors argue that women are more susceptible to the devil's influence because they are more credulous, weak, and carnal. They claim that women are more likely to practice witchcraft, which often involves sexual rituals and the use of magic to manipulate men. One of the more bizarre beliefs described in the Malleus is the idea that witches could cast spells to make men believe their penises had disappeared. The text includes stories of witches who collected these missing organs in birds' nests or boxes, where they supposedly moved and ate oats. These tales, while fantastical, reflect the deep-seated fears men had about women's sexual power and the threat they posed to male authority. In the Middle Ages, the fear of women's sexuality and the belief in witchcraft were intertwined, leading to the persecution of women accused of witchcraft. By the 16th century, this persecution had intensified, with a significant number of those accused being women. The Malleus Maleficarum played a crucial role in shaping these beliefs and justifying the persecution of witches, particularly women, who were seen as the embodiment of sexual danger and moral corruption. In the Middle Ages, the fear of women and their sexual power was deeply intertwined with the belief in witchcraft. The Malleus Maleficarum, a notorious text on which hunting written by two German friars, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, played a significant role in shaping these fears. The book is filled with stories of witches who, through their sexual activities, cause harm and mischief. For example, the text recounts tales of witches who allegedly steal men's penises, a horror that the men in the stories never realize is an illusion. This fear of castration, whether real or imagined, helped to solidify the image of women as dangerous and unpredictable. The Malleus also describes how witches seduce both men and women, often using their sexual charms to draw others into their practices. Women, according to the text, are particularly vulnerable to becoming witches after experiencing heartbreak or being scorned by their lovers. The book suggests that these women, feeling betrayed and desperate, turn to the devil for revenge or for the freedom to indulge in their desires. This narrative not only demonizes women, but also reflects a broader societal fear of women's sexuality. The text goes even further, claiming that witches have sexual intercourse with demons, known as incubi when male and succubi when female. These encounters are described in vivid detail, with witches often seen in public spaces, such as fields or woods, in states of apparent ecstasy, though only the witches themselves can see the demons. The succubi, in particular, are said to seduce men to collect their semen, which they then use to impregnate other women. This belief was not about pleasure, as demons are considered spirit beings without physical form, but rather about causing moral and physical corruption in humans. The Malleus was not just the work of two obscure friars. It became a widely read and influential text during the witch hunts of the 16th century. While the authors may have had a religious agenda, using existing misogyny to prove the existence of demons and strengthen their faith, The text undoubtedly contributed to the widespread persecution of women accused of witchcraft. However, it's important to understand that the fears and beliefs described in the Malleus were not the only views of women in medieval society. Women lived within a complex set of social norms and constraints, but they also made choices and exerted influence in various ways. The Church taught that virtuous women were either virgins or wives, but many people in medieval society did not strictly adhere to these ideals. Women could be coerced, but they could also make their own decisions, sometimes in defiance of societal norms. The evidence we have about medieval women's sexuality mostly comes from male written sources, particularly from the Church, which viewed women's sexual availability as a threat to their own chastity. However, this does not mean that all relationships outside of marriage were filled with guilt and self-loathing. Subgroups within medieval society likely had their own norms and standards, even if we don't have extensive records of them. Medieval women faced significant challenges, but they were not passive victims. They navigated their lives within the constraints of their society, sometimes defying the norms and expectations placed upon them. The anxiety surrounding women's sexuality, as reflected in texts like the Malleus, can be seen as an indication of the independence and influence that some women were able to exert, despite the limitations imposed on them. In medieval society, the rules about sex were very different for men and women. While the Church taught that any sexual activity outside of marriage was a sin, in reality, men faced much less scrutiny and punishment for their sexual behavior compared to women. Men could have mistresses or visit prostitutes, and while this was not considered ideal, it was often tolerated or even expected. The main issue arose when a man's actions interfered with another man's rights. For example, if a man slept with another man's wife, it was seen as stealing something valuable that belonged to someone else. Similarly, if a man took the virginity of someone else's daughter, it was considered a serious offense because it affected the family's honor and the daughter's future marriage prospects. However, if a man had sex with an unmarried woman who was not a virgin, it was seen as a much lesser sin. In some cases, it was not even considered a sin at all. This double standard meant that men's sexual behavior was often overlooked or forgiven, while women's sexual behavior was closely monitored and harshly judged. In the context of the Muslim tradition, the views on sexual behavior outside of marriage were somewhat similar. A man who had sex with another man's wife was seen as committing a serious offense, but a man who had sex with an unmarried woman who was not a virgin did not sin. This reflects a broader cultural attitude that placed a higher value on the sexual purity of women and the rights of men to control the sexual behavior of the women in their families. Despite the Church's teachings, medieval society often treated men's sexual transgressions with a degree of leniency. Men who were seen as less honorable for their sexual behavior might be urged to do penance, but they did not face the same level of social condemnation as women. This double standard was deeply ingrained in the social fabric of the time, influencing how people thought about and treated sexual behavior. In medieval times, the way men approached sexual relationships was deeply influenced by the social norms and hierarchies of the era. While any sexual relationship outside of marriage was technically considered illicit, the reality was much more nuanced. Men, especially those of higher social status, often faced lighter consequences for their sexual activities compared to women. This chapter explores how medieval men navigated these complex social and moral landscapes, focusing on the privileges and challenges they encountered. Men in the Middle Ages were often expected to seek sexual outlets, a notion encapsulated in the phrase, "boys will be boys." This cultural expectation meant that while the Church and societal norms formally condemned non-marital sex, many men, particularly young and unmarried ones, were seen as naturally driven by their desires. This was especially true for elite men, who could often engage in extramarital affairs without significant repercussions. For example, historical accounts from the 8th century, such as those by the Lombard writer Paul the Deacon, show that even royal and noble men could commit adultery without facing much condemnation. The high age at which men typically married, often in their late 20s or even later, meant that there was a significant period during which young men were expected to be sexually active. To manage this, many towns established municipal brothels, providing a socially acceptable outlet for male sexual desires. These brothels were seen as a way to channel young men's energies and prevent them from engaging in more disruptive behaviors. Visiting brothels was so common that it became a part of social bonding, often combined with activities like drinking. This was particularly prevalent among young elite men in cities like Venice and Florence, where family marriage strategies delayed their ability to marry. However, not all non-marital sexual encounters involved sex workers. Fornication could also be a part of courtship and a prelude to marriage. The lines between different types of sexual relationships were often blurred, as seen in a 15th century English case where a woman claimed that gifts from a man were intended as a marriage contract, while the man argued they were merely to maintain a sexual relationship. This ambiguity highlights the fluidity of sexual norms and the potential for misunderstandings. Despite the cultural expectation that men were more sexually aggressive, the consequences of sexual activity were different for men and women. Women faced the risk of pregnancy and significant social stigma, while men's reputations were generally less affected. This imbalance meant that men were often seen as the initiators of sexual encounters, even in contexts where women were depicted as sexually insatiable. For example, in medieval literature, women are sometimes portrayed as seductresses, but their seduction is usually aimed at arousing the man's desire rather than initiating the sexual act. The potential health risks of overindulgence in sex were recognized, and medical texts advised moderation. Diseases like syphilis and other sexually transmitted infections were known, and overindulgence could lead to illnesses or infertility. However, these concerns did not significantly deter men from engaging in sexual activity, especially outside of monastic settings. Masturbation was a topic of concern, particularly within religious contexts. While medieval medical texts did not focus on it as much as later Victorian writers, it was still considered a sin and subject to penance. Nocturnal emissions were also a source of moral concern, with some religious figures arguing that they required penance if they were the result of lustful thoughts. For most men outside the monastery, the risks of non-marital sexual activity were relatively low, as long as they did not overindulge or choose partners from higher social classes. The Church's teachings on chastity, while strict, did not always translate into widespread societal condemnation. Public shame punishments for fornication, such as processions with candles, were not as stigmatizing as one might expect, given the broader social acceptance of men's sexual behavior. Naming practices in medieval records also reflect the casual attitude toward men's sexual activities. Many bynames with sexual connotations, such as seduce woman or golden testicles, were used in official documents, indicating that such behavior was often seen as normal and even admired. In relationships characterized by power asymmetries, such as those between aristocratic men and their servants, coercion was often a factor. The rarity of rape prosecutions, especially involving servants, suggests that the line between consent and coercion was often blurred. While some long-term relationships may have involved some level of mutual agreement, the power dynamics made it difficult to determine the true nature of these interactions. Overall, medieval men's sexual lives were marked by a combination of social privilege and moral ambiguity. While the Church and formal norms condemned non-marital sex, the reality was that men, especially those of higher status, often faced few serious consequences for their sexual activities. This chapter provides a glimpse into the complex and often contradictory world of medieval male sexuality.